For decades, Republicans have been the party of federalism and local control. So why are they now threatening to shut down the government if police departments all over the country don't bow down before their far-right agenda? Let's rumble. With me for tonight's Lone Liberal Rumble is Horace Cooper, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. Horace, thanks for being here.
Good evening.
It's great to have you. So, if the government shuts down again, you can probably blame the Trump administration. According to Politico, Budget Director Mick Mulvaney is lobbying Republican lawmakers to insert into a must-pass spending bill language that would strip sanctuary cities of federal funding. This must-pass spending bill is due at the end of the month, and any measure taking aim at sanctuary cities would be a no-go for congressional Democrats. So whatever happened to federalism and local control? I thought that's what the Republican Party was all about. But now you guys are threatening to shut down the government to force local police departments that are obligated to enforce state and local laws to also act as agents of Washington, D.C. What's with this, Horace?
Eric Holder, President Obama, the ACLU, killed this concept when Arizona said, you know what, we'd like to exercise federalist options and engage in ways to minimize exposure from immigration excesses on our taxpayers. They were taken to court and told this policy must come from Washington. You don't get to do it on your own. Even if you want to do extra, we're not giving you permission to do extra. Now, if you want to do less, the feds can say, and you can't do less.
What does that have to do with what we're talking about?
The federal government under Barack Obama and Eric Holder said experimentation from a federalist perspective on immigration is largely unconstitutional. And they got the Supreme Court with 5 justices to go along with that.
But what we're talking about here is you've got, state and local police departments.
Yes.
Their job is to enforce state and local laws.
And Arizona had a state and local law that allowed them the discretion to decide if individuals they were encountering on an everyday basis were in fact non-citizens of the United States and unlawfully present.
We're talking SB 1020, right?
Yes, and they were told
papers, please,
they can't do that.
Why? Because it was openly discriminatory.
No. That's not what the court said. The court said this was a federal prerogative, and you don't have the authority to exercise space here.
Okay,
and that's what the ACLU argued, and that's what the federal government
back to my question. Again, this seems like it's confusing the issue.
On immigration, the argument has been lost. There is no longer the space for local governments to say, we want to do it this way, you want to do it that way, let's just see how it works out.
No, it's not that, Horace. That was an attempt by Arizona to be able to have their local officials enforce federal law and do it in ways that didn't comply with federal standards. And that was ultimately what it came down to in the Supreme Court. What I'm talking about here is the federal government trying to force states to enforce enforce federal law rather than when that's not the mandate of a state government. The state police. It's again, just for people who don't know what we're talking about.
The government should do it itself if it wants to have it done.
Well, it's like you've got the FBI investigating espionage. You don't have your local police department. You got the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms investigating people who are involved with high-powered explosives or building nuclear weapons in their bedrooms. It's not something the local police deal with. You've got the Treasury Department deals with counterfeiting. Local police can bust counterfeiters, but it always goes to the feds. And immigration is federal law, and we've got this huge, it's a massive department, ICE and all this, and they're the ones who are supposed to enforce the immigration laws. There are cities across the country that have said, we don't want our police departments to be enforcing immigration law because it's not our law. It's not our mandate. Why should we go through the expense Why should we expose our police officers to the risk? And why should we create a situation where people who are living in our communities whose immigration status is not valid or legal will be afraid to call our police when they're the victims of actual crimes, or be afraid to show up at the hospital if they have a horrible contagious disease? And you know, that seems like those are reasonable things to me. Why is it that the Republicans, who are always saying states' rights, states' rights, states' rights, are now saying, no, states have no rights, they have to do what we say?
Okay, at the beginning of your question to me, you gave these examples about the ATF, you gave the examples about espionage and all of these other things. You'll be surprised to find that, in fact, there are state analogs even for espionage, even for trafficking in nuclear weapons or other kinds of controlled substances. There are state analogs, and what hasn't happened is the federal government hasn't gone to court and told the states, you don't have the authority to do this. This is primarily our responsibility. But in the area of immigration, most recently, and for over 200 years, that wasn't the case. But in the area of immigration, most recently, they said the Supremacy Clause allows us to set what the policy is going to be. And that is why the states that would like to not cooperate and use their own resources are constrained to do so because of that holding. That's all that I'm saying is they blew this up. They could have allowed the state experimentation in immigration to go forward. They didn't like that.
Yeah, well, I really think you're misrepresenting this, Horace, because that, you know, that state experiment in immigration was you know, the Your Papers, Please bill. That was horrific. I mean, that was...
Bad policy isn't the same thing as not a federalist example.
Yeah, right.
And some people feel the same way about sanctuary cities. They feel it's dangerous.
No.
They feel it's destructive.
Well, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at sanctuary cities, in 2015, this is from the Washington Post today, in 2015, the typical sanctuary county experienced 654 fewer crimes per 100,000 residents than the typical non-sanctuary county. That's a 15% lower crime rate in sanctuary cities and counties.
So you'd like to let the local community decide whether or not they'd like that benefit.
I would.
You would.
Yes.
But you don't want to let the city or state of Arizona or Scottsdale or Phoenix decide we'd like to not have our schools overwhelmed by people that aren't lawful residents.
That wasn't the essence of Senate Bill 20.
Oh, that was its goal. That was its goal. But there were policy objectives. The point is, if we want federalism, you have to have federalism.
I mean,
if you don't want
keep
federalism,
going back to Chris Kobach's, you know, legislation. I mean, the thing was, well, okay, we're talking in circles. Let me move along to Social Security, if I may. As part of his tax reform plan, Donald Trump is considering doing away with the payroll tax that funds Social Security. This is a terrible idea. It would turn Social Security from the self-funding program that it is today into something funded by what's called general revenue. And since anything funded by general revenue is considered discretionary spending and thus subject to the budget process, this change in definition would expose Social Security to the spending cut frenzies Republicans have every time they get control of government. In other words, it's a roundabout way to cut Social Security. So can Trump voters trust Trump? I mean, he ran on protecting Social Security, and now he's got a bunch of people around him, including Mick Mulvaney, who want to, you know, take it down.
Well, first of all, I think this is a trial balloon. Part of the reason why I'm fairly confident it's not going anywhere is this idea that there would be some new value-added tax or post-consumption activity assessment tax. That is a terrible idea. It's very destructive for the business community, for the ability of the economy to grow. And if this is tied to that, those two things are very unlikely to be able to go forward. At the same time, I will tell you, I'm not convinced at all that we're going to see Social Security stay the same as it was in 2016 after the next 8 years. Eventually, we're going to have to make changes. That doesn't mean
we're going to have to lift the cap and have rich people pay into it just like everybody else.
That doesn't mean that it won't be a pay-as-you-go program, but it will mean that the program is going to have to change.
Well, I don't disagree. We need to have the Koch brothers pay the same percentage as you and me.
Well, if the Koch brothers can receive from Social Security an equivalent of what they pay, they would. Our system caps the maximum that people can be paid. So of course it caps the maximum tax that they pay in.
Well, that would be one argument.
And if you don't do that, then it is equivalent to just a general tax program,
because
then it's not self-pay as you go.
The assertion you're making is basically that Social Security is just a retirement program, and it's not. It's a poverty insurance program, number one, for elderly people, and number two, a third of all Social Security payments are actually for literally widows and orphans. But anyway, I want to get to. We just have 1 minute left, Horace.
Okay.
And Donald Trump is this whole thing with Steve Bannon. Donald Trump is now saying he refused basically today with the New York Post to defend Steve Bannon. What does this mean? What's going on in your party? What's going on in the White House?
I think people misread these things. There are going to always be movement in an administration. There are always going to be people who rise and fall. Karl Rove was thought to be quintessential to any operation of the Bush administration, and yet eventually they moved on without him. The defense secretary during the first Bush administration, Rumsfeld was thought to be critical.
Yeah.
I'm saying Bannon is
Anybody
no different.
can go. Yeah. Horace,
Thank you.
Great having you with us tonight. Thank you. Horace Cooper.